Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Salt Lake City Community of Christ Sunday School. My name is Carla Long, and I'm the pastor of the Salt Lake City congregation, and I am really excited to be welcoming Apostle Lachlan Mackay and Stassi Cramm, who is a member of the First Presidency, for our Sunday School today. We're going to be talking about moving toward Jesus, the peaceful one, from a warlike people, like for instance when we were in Nauvoo, to today considering nonviolence. Apostle Lachlan Mackay will be talking about the history part of that because he's really, really good at that. And First Presidency member Stassi Cramm will be talking about where we are today and how we are considering nonviolence and how it's been a discussion in Community of Christ for a long time. So, Lach, I'm going to welcome you onto the screen right now. Hi, Lach.
Hello, Carla. How are you doing this morning?
Good. Thank you so much for being here, Lach.
It is a privilege to be with you. I'm joining from the bank of the Mississippi River in Nauvoo, Illinois. And as you suggested, I'm a big history geek, so I'm going to talk some history this morning.
All right, Lach, well, I'm just going to let you take it away.
Here we go. From an anonymous U.S. artillery officer writing from the city of Nauvoo in May of 1842. Yesterday was a great day among the Mormons. Their legion, to the number of 2,000 men, was paraded. The evolutions of the troops would do honor to any body of armed militia and approximates very closely to our regular forces. It is true they are part of the militia of the state of Illinois, but then there are no troops in the states like them in point of enthusiasm and warlike aspect, yea, warlike character. Before many years, this legion will be 20 and perhaps 50,000 strong and still augmenting. These Mormons are accumulating like a snowball rolling down an inclined plane, which in the end becomes an avalanche. They have appointed your namesake, Captain Bennett, and I am assured that he is now under pay derived from the tithings of this warlike people. I've seen his plans for fortifying Nauvoo. I arrived here incognito on the 1st, and from the great preparation for the military parade, was induced to stay to see the turnout, which I confess has astonished and filled me with fears for future consequences. The Mormons, it is true, are now peaceable, but the lion is asleep. Take care and don't rouse him. How is it that Community of Christ, one branch on the family tree of this warlike people, ended up with the pursuit of peace or shalom as a core value or enduring principle, with pursue peace on earth as a mission initiative, and with a temple built on a portion of the 1830s temple lot in Jackson County, Missouri, designated as an ensign of peace and dedicated to the pursuit of peace? How could a people captured by the spirit of militarism in the 19th century become so intensely focused on peace by the 21st century? This morning, I'm just going to be telling some simple stories that I hope will help you understand how that transition began in the 19th century with Joseph Smith III, the oldest surviving son of Emma and Joseph Smith Jr. In the process, I also hope to introduce you to the way in which peace has been reframed in Community of Christ as far more than simply the absence of violent conflict. As the late historian D. Michael Quinn points out, we were not a warlike people in our earliest years. He notes that the 1833 Doctrine and Covenants section 95, or LDS 98, called us to renounce war and proclaim peace. According to this section, a violent response when attacked was only justified after turning the other cheek 3 times. And even then, we were encouraged to choose peace yet again. This section also requires us to debate divine rule, not secular rule, regarding war and militarism. So we can only fight back, it says, when commanded by the Lord to do so. We soon succumbed, though, to the frontier culture of violence, and by the late 1830s in far west Missouri, we did not generally initiate violent conflict, but we didn't hesitate to strike back. I believe the violence of far west and Nauvoo and his negative reaction to it was profoundly formative for young Joseph Smith III as he grew to adulthood and affiliated with the new organization of the church. He began to reclaim the gospel's emphasis on peace expressed in the early 1830s. I think many of you are familiar with the Nauvoo Legion, second in size only to the U.S. Standing Army in the 1840s. Now, much of what I'm going to share with you comes from Joseph III's memoirs, so he's looking back later in life. But here's what he said. The Legion undoubtedly helped to cultivate in the people a certain dependence upon human strength and power as a defense against the encroachment of the persecutors, perhaps a lamentable fact. Remember, Joseph III was not quick to criticize his father, but he goes on to say, I believe it was a mistake to allow the spirit of militarism to take possession of the leading authorities of the church. Emma also apparently thought that was a mistake. Joseph III talks about spending a little time in something called Bailey's Boys Troops, which was an auxiliary to the Nauvoo Legion, but he quickly moved out of it, he said, he believed due to his mother's influence. After Joseph Smith Jr.'s assassination, the state legislature in Illinois pulled Nauvoo's city charter. That meant that we no longer existed as a city. We were just a bunch of people living next to each other. And tragically, we turned, since we had no organized police force anymore, to vigilantism to try and be rid of undesirables. Joseph III witnessed some of this activity one day. In recent years, we have almost romanticized something called the Whistling and Whittling Brigade as little boys with pocket knives and sticks who would surround undesirables and whistle and encourage them to leave town. I think tragically, the reality is more like men with machetes and spears. Joseph III witnessed a group of men driving Austin Cowles from town one day. Austin had been a mid-level church leader in Nauvoo, but he was opposed to plural marriage, opposed to polygamy, which meant he was not in favor with the leaders after Joseph Smith Jr.'s death. So Joseph III saw him being driven from town one day, and as a teenager, he started shouting at those who were driving him out, trying to convince them to leave that poor old man alone. It didn't work, but here's what Joseph III said about that, looking back. The intolerance of bigotry, long complained of by the church as exhibited towards the elders preaching abroad, found lodgment in the city and raged with rabid venom against the apostate and recalcitrant. All those who dared to express an opinion not in strict accord with the rulers were ostracized. May God soon send the day when the curse of intolerance may be known no more in the land. Words of Joseph Smith III. By the early 1860s, Nauvoo is almost entirely German in some form. Germans, French, Austrians, Swiss who were German speaking. And Joseph III believed that those people were being taken advantage of because of their lack of familiarity with our language and customs. So as Justice of the Peace, Joseph III would often do their legal work for free to try and protect them. Here's what he said about that. It did not suit me to see industrious citizens oppressed because of their lack of familiarity with our language and customs. Joseph III had a really strong sense of fairness and justice and would see that as closely related to the pursuit of peace. Prior to Joseph Smith Jr.'s death, he and Emma had run a hotel. Emma continued that after her first husband's death and for years kept boarding houses. On one occasion, two of Emma's boarders, a male and a female, seemed to be in an inappropriate relationship as she saw it, and she invited them to move out. The man got angry. He left, but he came back with a gun and threatened Emma. That infuriated young Joseph, but he was not yet at the age of his majority, meaning he wasn't 18 yet, so he didn't think he could do anything about it. He hoped his stepfather, Louis Bideman, would. He didn't. And a number of events through the years made the anger Joseph III felt for this man who had threatened Emma with a gun made Joseph III even angrier. And eventually this anger grew into this malignant hatred. That became a problem when Joseph III joined the reorganization Community of Christ. And when he became a minister, he said every time he said the Lord's Prayer, it would twinge him, it would stick him, it would get him. He knew that he couldn't continue to be a minister while harboring this hate for this man. So he said, I set myself to the task and was eventually able to overcome it. I was able to forgive this man. He also said this, looking back, the experience taught me a lesson. I had a clear understanding of what men were prone to feel of any unworthy nature than I could have obtained had I not had this experience and learned to know what it was to hate a fellow being. The knowledge helped to make me humble and to exercise sympathy and charity for others struggling under like feelings. Hatred is a cruel, destructive, and unlovely thing, and wholly unbecoming a Christian. Joseph III understood that peace, that this shalom that we'll talk about today, required things like forgiveness for those who have wronged you. By the 1860s, of course, the Civil War has broken out, and there was significant debate about how members of Community of Christ should respond to the draft. Part of that debate was the result of something that Joseph Smith III did kind of by accident. He went to a recruiting rally in Nauvoo one day. There was a quota. Nauvoo was supposed to come up with X number of men, and a military officer was the one that was offering the recruiting speech. He was not doing a very compelling job. Some of Joseph III's friends came in. They had been at the local tavern having more than a few beers, apparently. They were German, and they saw Joseph III there, this new minister, and they thought, well, let's have a little fun with Joseph. And so they started calling for him to stand up and continue this recruiting speech, trying to get folks to sign up. Joseph III didn't want to, didn't think he was dressed appropriately, didn't think it was appropriate, but eventually he was overcome with this spirit of patriotism, and he stood up and he started speaking. And by the time he was done, a significant number of men had enlisted. Joseph III then went home and started thinking about what he'd done and wondering about whether or not that was appropriate. He invited church members to participate in this discernment process. And eventually, here's what he came back with. When the answer came, it was clear, definite, and unmistakable. Do not enlist. Enlisting makes your military service an individual and voluntary action, whereby you will be responsible for the blood you might shed while in service. Wait, if drafted, the responsibility is lifted. Do not shirk any duty the service requires, for through the conscription, the deed becomes a national sin instead of a personal one. So apparently thought still a sin, but a national sin instead of a personal one. This is a subject of significant discussion in Community of Christ through the years. What does it mean to support our church members who decide to participate in the armed forces? Joseph III was very clear to say he passed no judgment against those who did decide to enlist, because particularly in this context, he was talking about the Civil War. He hated slavery. So he said there are members of our faith who have enlisted and served honorably, and he was not in any way going to condemn them. Fast forward 1890s, Joseph III is in Carthage, Illinois, the Hancock County seat, and he sees an old man sitting in the shade of the courthouse in a wheelchair, and he recognizes him. It is Thomas Sharp. If there is any one person responsible for the deaths of Joseph and Hiram Smith, it's Thomas Sharp. He called for the use of powder and ball to be rid of the Mormon problem, and at least one account says that he was in the jail and pulled a trigger. Joseph III saw this man, walked past, and said, "Good morning." That was the end of it. But when some of our church members found out that Joseph III had dared to speak to the man responsible for the death of his father, they were angry. And at least one writes a letter complaining to Joseph III that he was civil to this man. Joseph III's response was a letter in the Saints Herald, our church periodical, called Required to Forgive. And he made it abundantly clear. Let me clarify. He didn't say this to Thomas Sharp. He said, "Good morning." But he says to the members of Community of Christ, I forgive this man. If there's any justice to be had, it's going to be in the hereafter. There was a civil trial. He was acquitted. any justice will be in the hereafter. And he went on to say that he remembered that our blessed Lord, our living exemplar, when suffering from the cruel pangs inflicted upon him to his death, lifted his eyes and heart to his Father and said, "Forgive them, they know not what they do." He made it abundantly clear that we were required to do the same. Not long after the Civil War came to an end, Joseph III was trading letters with another church leader, and they were talking about war and our response and peace. And here's what Joseph III said in that letter. And this goes back to that section 95 or 98 that talks about how you can only fight back if you're commanded to do so. So here's what he said: "As to the principle of warlike saints, when God commands me to fight, I shall do so, but not before. I am strongly inclined to believe that he will not require me to fight. Whether God may or may not at some future day raise up a warlike people is a question open for dispute to those who may love discussion. But all are agreed that there is now no present commandment. And in the absence of the command, peace is eminently our mission. Hence, my voice is for peace, and let God take care of his own." This is just a little insight into how Joseph III started to return Community of Christ back to that path towards peacemakers in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. The story continues, but we will get into that later. Carla.
Thank you so much, Locke. That was super interesting. You know, I've heard like tiny bits and pieces about a few of the things that you said, like the whittling and whistling crew and stuff, but I definitely did not know the whole story. So I thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. I also want to say sorry to the folks on Zoom. I heard you had a little bit of technical difficulty, but you're back now. So hello, everyone on Zoom. Hello, everyone on Facebook Live. Hello, everyone on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us. I also want to say, make sure you get your questions ready. We will have a Q&A time after Stassi talks about where we are now in considering nonviolence. So I'm going to welcome Stassi on in just a second. Stassi, hello.
Hey, Carla.
Oh, thank you so much for being here, Stassi.
Thanks, Carla. It's great to be here with everyone. So I'm actually downriver a little bit from Locke on the Mississippi. So I'm on the west bank of the Mississippi, just north of the Missouri River in St. Charles, Missouri. So it's great to be with everyone. I want to add my thanks to that of Carla's for Locke's sharing. I always love hearing the restoration history through Locke's wonderful storytelling skills. And he did such a great job providing historical context that helps us see how Community of Christ has been shaped. So today, Community of Christ is a movement of people who have diverse viewpoints on peace and nonviolence. The role of nonviolence in achieving peace in the world is complex and has many cultural, theological, and personal perspectives. Amid our diversity, our goal is to look for what unifies us. Analyzing occurrences of peace and active World Conference resolutions and Doctrine and Covenants sections gives us just a glimpse into what we have collectively agreed to as a people through actions of the body. You can find our World Conference resolutions that are currently active by Googling World Conference resolutions, also known as WCRs, on the church's website at seaofchrist.org. If you were to do this and to look through them, you would learn that the word peace occurs around 100 times in the active WCRs and about 79 times in the Doctrine and Covenants. The words justice or injustice don't appear quite as much, but they do appear about 39 times in WCRs and 22 times in the Doctrine and Covenants. Interestingly, the word nonviolence is not in the Doctrine and Covenants, at least based on my search, and only appeared 4 times, all in WCR 1319, which was approved at the 2019 World Conference. But I'll get back to that WCR shortly. The occurrences of these words show up in about 29 active resolutions, but that doesn't actually start until around 1980 and then later. And of the 79 occurrences of peace in the Doctrine and Covenants, 29 of them, so a good percentage of them, were focused in sections 161 through 165. That's in the Community of Christ Doctrine and Covenants. The WCR peace topics include a whole variety of subjects like human rights, racism, apartheid, military service, nuclear arms reduction, priesthood status, earth stewardship, just to name a few. So hopefully this brief review demonstrates that there has been a growing focus on the importance of peace and justice in the life of Community of Christ as we now are engaging in this topic of nonviolence. But let's go back for just a moment to 1982, when WCR 1177, which is titled Peace, was approved. For me, I think this resolution is a foundational document that articulates the church's current position on peace. It has 6 sections with quite a bit of detail in each one. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to look it up. But let me briefly summarize the key proclamations. 1 is that we as a church promote peace. 2 is that we as a church share the responsibility for world conditions. 3 is that we as a church oppose all forms of destructive violence, such as national and international conflict, war, withholding of food, terrorism, and mental and physical abuse. 4 is that we as a church urge nations towards responsible reduction of the instruments of mass destruction. And 5, that we as a church emphasize that peace is not attained by mere non-participation in violence. Locke alluded to the fact that we have moved to a place where it's not okay to just not participate in violence. Our call is to be actively engaged in creating a much more just world. So if we move from 82 to 1984, when Section 156 of the Community of Christ Doctrine and Covenants was approved by conference, that's the section that included the counsel that the temple and Independence should begin being built and that it should be dedicated to the pursuit of peace and for reconciliation and healing of the spirit. That was no surprise and felt very consistent with who we were becoming, given the foundation on peace that was put in place 2 years earlier with WCR 1177. So let's now fast forward about another 21 years to 2005, when our current president prophet, Stephen M. Vesey, was ordained. He cast a vision for Community of Christ that focused on sharing the peace of Jesus Christ. His sermon ended with these comments, and I quote, "We are called to shape a diverse family of peace in Jesus Christ from among the cultures and nations of the world for the blessing and salvation of humanity. We are called to give of ourselves and our resources generously so that our witness of Christ and Zion can increase, not decrease, throughout the world. We are called. I am ready to respond," he said, "to the call to share the peace of Jesus Christ. Are you?" End quote. Out of this clarion call, Community of Christ has journeyed in remembering and going deeper in our understanding of our identity, message, missions, and beliefs. Part of this was the articulation of our 9 enduring principles, which Locke mentioned, which define both who we are and who we are still becoming. They are like our DNA guiding our growth in nature. And as Locke said, one of these 9 is pursuit of peace. Through this enduring principle, we acknowledge that we are embodying our belief that God wants shalom, which is justice, reconciliation, well-being, wholeness, and peace for all creation. We proclaim that Jesus Christ, the embodiment of God's shalom, reveals the meaning of God's peace in all aspects of life. We embrace the vision of Zion, promoting God's reign on earth as proclaimed by Jesus Christ through the leavening influence of just and peaceful communities. We courageously and generously share the peace of Jesus Christ with others. And we open ourselves to be led by the Holy Spirit as we work with God and others to restore God's shalom to creation. And we celebrate God's peace wherever it appears or is being pursued by people of goodwill. Another part of our journey to remember and understand who we were and who we are is by adding to our mission statement and seeing its connection to Christ's mission. 5 mission initiatives have been identified that guide what we are called to do as we live Christ's mission. One of those mission initiatives, which Locke mentioned, was pursue peace on earth, or as it has been articulated in recent scripture in 165, to pursue peace on and for the earth. This reminds us that we as a people are poised to restore Christ's covenant of peace, even the Zion of our hopes. And we understand that the hope of Zion will become reality when we live Christ's peace and generously share Christ's peace with others. And we fulfill God's ultimate vision as we individually and collectively promote peacemaking throughout the world for all people and seek justice. This is so much more than just simply being not involved in violent activities. This is about a positive movement of creation, creating God's vision of shalom through our relationships and our actions in the world. In this brief look at how Community of Christ is growing in our understanding about peace, there has clearly been a lot said and written, but all the World Conference resolutions and statements about peace don't mean much if we as a people aren't putting into action all that we have collectively committed to as a movement. So I mentioned World Conference Resolution 1319 on nonviolence, which was approved in 2019. It had 3 resolved statements. 1 committed the church to discuss the role of nonviolence. The second committed us to develop resources to assist and guide the church's discussions about nonviolence. And the third was an action item for the First Presidency to provide a report or a statement to the World Conference. Embracing the commitments made in this resolution will help us discover what unifies us as a people in the best way to respond to situations of injustice and to take actions to bring about peace. As the 2019 World Conference was ending, President Veazey brought focus to the challenge before the church. Let me quote just a portion of his closing sermon. And I quote, "Scripture testifies that all creation waits with eager longing for peaceful humanity to appear on the world stage to turn the tide of hate, agony, and destruction. With that in mind, the central question raised by our text looms even larger. Are we moving toward Jesus, the peaceful one? I continue to feel the Holy Spirit urging us to go much deeper and further in exploring, embodying, and sharing the peace of Jesus Christ in all the locations and vocations of our lives. As we do, we will discover the essential meaning of restoration. We will discover our best selves and brightest future. We will discover all the surprising ways that Christ-inspired community weaves diverse people together as expressions of the gospel of peace. And we will discover deep community in Christ as a wellspring of living water, rising and revealing the currents of God's grace flowing through our lives." End quote. Since the 2019 conference, the church has been reflecting on this guiding question: are we moving towards Jesus, the peaceful one? It has guided and continues to guide our conversations and our actions. It has also focused our resource development as we prepare to consider a draft statement on nonviolence at the 2023 World Conference. To help us prepare, many resources have been provided as part of the series on Jesus, the Peaceful One. Just Google Guiding Question at seaofchrist.org and you'll get a whole listing of what's available. You can also find material at the Herald House website under the member-created menu option and the nonviolence topic. In the Reunion 2021 adult text being studied right now across the church and available at the church's website, the resource ends with an invitation for people to send the First Presidency their thoughts and reflections on what should be included in the draft statement on nonviolence we will consider in 2023. I hope everyone that is listening here today will respond to that invitation to share your thoughts on what we should say as a people on nonviolence. What we collectively say about nonviolence is important, but even more important is how the conversations, the exploration, and the respectful debate will shape our understanding and engagement in the world. We are called and sent to create God's vision of shalom in the world. It's not about just standing by and doing no harm. It's about being actively engaged in ways that represent the way Jesus would speak to power and help change the systems of our world.
Thank you so much, Stassi. That was wonderful. I work for Community of Christ, and I had no idea that was all of that stuff was happening. So thank you so much. That was very informative. I really appreciate it. So we do have some questions coming in. The first one is for Locke, actually. And I'm going to bring you back on screen, Locke, so I can talk to you. Hi, Locke. So the question that's come in for you is something like, what are some specific things that Joseph Smith III did to move us more toward being a peace church?
So I think that by elevating the discussion on whether or not to enlist, that was part of it. Now, we've often forgotten that. And we also often came up with workarounds. So I have a friend from the Nauvoo congregation, since moved away, who desperately wanted to enlist in World War II, but he was too young. And so he asked his mom for permission, and she said no, and pulled out the words of Joseph Smith III. And so he knew he couldn't enlist. So instead, as soon as he was old enough, he went to the draft board and asked to be drafted. I don't think that was the intent that Joseph III was trying to raise. But he also did things like name, I think, through using language and symbols. So using things like naming his Nauvoo congregation, which met upstairs in the Red Brick Store in the 1860s, the Olive Branch. By this, I don't think Joseph III gets credit for this, but this is kind of the culture, by naming the new community in Iowa, Lamoni, after the pacifist king in the Book of Mormon. So elevating pacifism, in this case, in the life of the church. Maybe one of the more significant things was his role in the creation of the church seal in the 1870s. Now, it starts as the corporate seal that you stamp on documents, but it becomes the most beloved symbol of the church. And he was one of 3 people on the committee that did that. Of course, it features a lion and a lamb and a child and the word peace underneath it, connection to Isaiah. Those are some of the ways he did that. He also encouraged his son, Frederick Madison Smith, to engage in these national peace conferences in the early 20th century. And on his deathbed, Joseph III, I believe, like many, believed that peace was soon to break out across the world. There was this desperate hope that peace would triumph. And of course, within 6 months of his death, World War I was coming into being. So just a few of the things that he did.
I'm so glad you mentioned the peace sign, because I thought that's one thing that he did, which I have right here behind me, which is really, really important to me as well. Thank you, Lach, so much for talking about that. I have another question. It's for Stassi. So let me bring Stassi on. Hi, Stassi.
Hi, Carla.
So the question for you, I don't know how many people realize, or how much people realize, how much work goes in between world conferences. It doesn't, we don't just start planning it the week before, for instance. And I know that a lot of work goes into, like, people actually are thinking and working towards these world conference resolutions that you're talking about. Can you talk a little bit about how that works? Like, who is working on these world conference resolutions? You're talking about 13, 19, and how does that work? Sorry, Stassi, I think I jumped off there for a second. So the question was, I think, how does the World Conference resolutions, how do they get worked on in between World Conference? And so, like, who works on them, and how do you hear about them? All that stuff.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You're absolutely right. We take World Conference resolutions very seriously. Those are basically like our instructions that come out of World Conference as far as what's important to the church. So following every World Conference, the presidency sits down and we go through all of the resulting actions, and we develop a report to the church about that. And then we make assignments of each resolution that requires ongoing actions. Oftentimes, those resolutions are assigned to a world church team. So as an example, the resolution on 1319 on nonviolence is being tracked by the Peace and Justice team in addition to the First Presidency. And then if there isn't a world church team that fits under the particular topic, sometimes we might look to a quorum, or sometimes we create a team to respond to a resolution. About once a year, the presidency creates a report on what the status is on all of the active resolutions that require specific actions, and we publish that on the website and in the Herald, because we feel like it's really important to keep the church informed as to what is happening. If anyone ever has a question about what's going on about a particular World Conference resolution, they are welcome to email the First Presidency at fp@seaofchrist.org and ask about the resolution, and we will make sure to get that person an update.
That's fabulous. So one thing I really love about Community of Christ is how easy it is to connect with the First Presidency. So friends, you heard her. She said, if you want to email the First Presidency, you can totally email them and ask them questions. That's very, very cool. Okay, so we have another question coming up, and it is for Lach. And Lach, your question is, so we heard a lot about Joseph Smith III, and Joseph Smith III, his reasons for promoting peace within the reorganization. But what about other presidents of the church? I didn't really do a count up. We've had, what, 8 presidents? I'm probably wrong.
Let me add them up really quick. Joseph Jr., Joseph III, who's widowed twice, married 3 times, having kids in his early 70s. 3 of his children became our prophet presidents. The third, W. Wallace Smith, 98 years after his father had. followed by Wallace B. Smith, W. Grant McMurray, Stephen Veazey, 8.
I was right. Oh, man.
Do all that.
I feel pretty good about myself right now. So what have other presidents of the church done? Have they had that same level of commitment to peace or not?
I would say Wallace B. definitely, and drawing on some language from the Fishing River revelation, we were heavily impacted by this called the Lift Up an Ensign of Peace, with the failed March of Zion's camp. So our Independence Temple that President Smith was very much involved in talks about lifting up an ensign of peace and the pursuit of peace, and dedicated to the pursuit of peace. So definitely Wallace B. Smith. I think Israel A. Smith, his idea of peace was kind of Zionizing the world. So where Fred M. Smith had talked a lot about gathering to Zion, this kind of industrial Zion concept, and building this central community that would be a signal to the world. Israel is more focused probably on staying home and doing that work. But I got to say that our path is not a straight line. There are ups and downs. And at times we would kind of go along with the culture. So Fred M. Smith, for example, ends up antagonistic to pacifists, and uses language like coward, which is pretty uncomfortable. Although I just ran across a whole bunch of Gandhi quotes that talk about how he would rather use violence than be a coward when it comes to fighting for justice. So I don't know what to make of that. I need to spend a lot more time on that. But Fred M. very much was caught up in the patriotic and maybe even nationalistic fervor of World War I and II, after a time when he was very much focused on these international peace movements. F. Henry Edwards is probably maybe the best known example of a peace activist in the church, although he was not the president. He was in the presidency, a member of the First Presidency for years. And as a teenager in the UK, he chose not to fight. He chose pacifism. And when tried for that, he was asked apparently if he would be willing to serve on a minesweeper. If you don't want to fight, okay, would you serve on a minesweeper? And his response apparently is, sure, as long as I can sweep English mines as well as German, which I don't think helped his cause. So he's imprisoned for a number of years. And interestingly, he ends up Fred M. Smith's son-in-law. So Fred M., not a fan of pacifism, but F. Henry Edwards imprisoned for his stance against World War I, against fighting. So we have a mixed, like so many topics, our response has been mixed. It's not been a straight line, but we're generally moving in the right direction.
Thanks so much, Locke. I really appreciate hearing that about all the different presidents of the reorganization. So we do have another question come in. I think it's going to be for Stassi. Let me pull Stassi up. Okay, Stassi, here's a question for you. What about the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna, I'm not sure how to say that, and the Krishna conversation on war? The Smedley Butler booklet on war is a racket, which shows war as a money-making business. The comparison in government manipulation along with violence to the environment. I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but could you talk a little bit, if you can, talk a little bit about war as a money-making business? And I don't know if you've heard of those books, War is a Racket. I have not, actually, but could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I'm not overly familiar with all of the material that's being referenced, but obviously there are a variety of positions as to what causes war, what's the pushing cause, and obviously I think those pieces of material are lifting up some of those perspectives. I think what's important for us to understand is where are there situations of injustice, and what's the most appropriate way to respond to those situations of injustice, not only on an individual basis, but on a national and governmental basis. So I mentioned the Herald House website and the members created material on nonviolence. Underneath that tab, we actually have a really nice resource that explores the different motives behind why nations go to war and help people explore things like holy war, just war. And so I would just really encourage our listeners to pull out some of those resources and take a look at them. There's also a reference to or a study guide for the Wink book about Jesus's nonviolence third way. So some great resources to help people explore and look at, and use those as kind of a measuring stick for other things that they're reading.
That is very helpful, Stassi. Thank you so much. And I think that we're coming close to the end of our Sunday school, actually. So I really appreciate Locke and Stassi. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come and talk to us about this. I've learned a lot, and I hope that everyone watching has learned a lot. If you are on Facebook Live and you would like to join our worship service, which will take place at 11 o'clock, so just in about 10 minutes, there'll be a slide that comes up that you can see the meeting ID, so you can join us. Apostle Lachlan Mackay will be one of our speakers, as well as Elder Nancy Ross, Gina Colvin, Steve Addison, and Michael Wright. We're going to have a lot of speakers, but they're going to be short, I promise. It's going to be a communion service, and we really hope that you can join us. Stassi, I'm going to bring you on one more time so you can say bye. Thank you so much for being here, Stassi.
Yeah, it was great to be with everyone. Thank you so much, Carla, for the invitation. And I'm sorry I won't be able to join you for worship, but I will be worshiping with Rocky Mountain Mission Center today. So blessings to everyone.
From the other side of the Rocky Mountains. Thank you so much, Stassi. I really appreciate what you had to say.
Thank you.
So we're going to be closing out this part. And so if you are getting ready to worship with us, go ahead and take a 5-minute break and grab some bread and juice or bread and water, if that's what you prefer for your communion. And we will start that communion worship very shortly. Thank you so much.